My name is Jewel Maranan. I'm a documentary filmmaker from the Philippines. I'm also a cinematographer, and I've also been recently producing films in Asia. I did two feature-length films, which I directed and shot. The first one is entitled Tondo Beloved, and the second one is entitled In the Claws of a Century Wanting. Both films are set in the same district in Manila, which houses practically a quarter of the capital city's population. So for over 8 years, I was making documentary in this area.
Okay, so for a film In the Claws of a Century Wanting, could you explain the title? And is the name in Filipino different from it in English, and why?
Yeah. The title in English is In the Claws of a Century Wanting, and in Filipino, the title is Sa Palad ng DANTAONG Kulang. I changed the clause because in Filipinos the clause is this, like this, and the Tagalog translation I use Sa Palad, which is palm, and the difference of meaning comes from a cultural background in the Philippines. Palad is a palm. And while I wanted to use claws as a symbol of violence in the English title, I wanted to use the palm as a symbol of fate, for example, or having been in the mercy of the palm of history, for example. Yeah. So there's a very slight nuance in the English and Tagalog translation.
I know you were in Tanzania for 2 years before your shooting, so is there any film or filmmaker that inspired you to create this film?
What really taught me filmmaking is exactly the place where I stayed and I did the film. It's like what I was seeing was training me how to see them. So this was more my inspiration rather than other films, for instance. Yeah.
So during your production, you think which one is harder, to get started or being able to continue?
The thing is that I think with filmmaking, getting started is not something that you can force. To start something is it just comes to you. No, if something doesn't come to you, it's very hard to invent, to make it, to manufacture circumstances for films to be made, especially with documentary. So it's I would definitely say that it's trying to make it and to survive and to endure different difficulties throughout, probably even years and years of sticking to a vision, to an idea, is the more trying aspect of filmmaking.
And there are many families, many residents in the port area, but why you choose those 4 particular people to be your protagonists? I worked with a researcher who also had the same background of me, because I did a long period of social work in Tondo before I actually made the film. So I hired a friend of mine who was also a social worker to look for 4 different characters in 4 stages of life. So we had a character in birth, a character in youth, in adulthood, and in death. So we had to search the community for probably tens of different people who are in birth, in youth, in adulthood, and people who were like having, who just died and was having funeral in the community. And I normally, after seeing different possibilities of people whom I can film, I normally have 2 criteria. Of course, I'm not very rigid about it. It comes more by intuition whether you want to film with this person or not. But in general, if I summarize the intuition, it's more about having people who not necessarily have a very pronounced persona, but people who are silent but who exude a certain dignity and can definitely represent a condition instead of simply themselves or their own lives. That's one. But even if I find the perfect person, if
if they do not inhabit the spaces that I think are very important for the vision of the film, I would not choose them to be with my for my film. I want to choose people who inhabit spaces that have a lot of holes or windows where you can see through outside and you have a very far view, because then that gives a very strategic position for me as a filmmaker to be able to merge the living spaces of the people with the landscape that they exist in. And so I'm able to combine the personal narrative and the larger narrative, not just as a backdrop, but as a part of the daily life, daily time.
We know this documentary is actually very serious, but during your production, is there any fun anecdote that impressed you the most to keep going?
Yeah, it's actually, yes, generally serious, but I think there's also a lot of humorous elements, especially in the daily life. And I don't know if it's visible or like appreciable for the international audience, but there's a lot of humor injected in it as well. But it's not humor that I intentionally injected, but humor that just comes out from the course of people living their lives. And a lot of it come out from characters who are the children in the film. For example, there's this scene which I find very funny, and a lot of my friends find very funny, when the son of my pregnant protagonist was sick for the day, and he was very talkative, and I think he felt that because he was always observing me while I was filming and looking at what is she filming or whatever, and I think somehow this kid wanted to collaborate with me, and so while having like a small talk with her mother. And she saw that I was like shifting the camera from her mother to him, and he knew that he was important in the scene. So he invented a scene which turned out to be a very funny scene in the film. He started to kick on the wall of the house and said, like, "Mama, why is the wall shaking? Why did not Papa nail the iron sheets?" or something like that. It looks like a very spontaneous scene. It was actually funny, but I knew and I felt that this kid was trying to, collaborate with me, and yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of these kinds of moments that was also included in the film, and most of these spontaneous, funny moments are coming from the kids. So it's a delight to film with them.
Yeah, and your documentaries focus a lot on the historical impact on people's ordinary life. So could you tell us more about your ideas?
Yeah, I think from the very beginning of my filmmaking, I was interested in how history is visible in ordinary life. It's not because I found a concept and I wanted to look for it in the place. As I said earlier, this place where I filmed taught me how to look at things. It's not like I had this way of looking and I applied it there. It taught me how to look at things. And history is actually very visible in these spaces. And once I found out that history was visible in these spaces, anywhere I go, I already could see and decode like how history is visible in any space. But it's because of this concentration of meanings that you could find in Tondo, Manila. For example, it's very visible there how the world economy is changing because it's a port area. So we could see almost like it doesn't stop, 24 hours, container vans coming from so many different countries. And it's for sure it's also very visible here in Hong Kong. Like you could see almost the entire world passing through this community, like container vans from Italy, from Japan, from China, from Korea. And I realized when I was there that this is a very peculiar site. It's probably a site that you wouldn't find in another century. It's a site that's very particular at this time in human development, in the development of human civilization. And so I became more and more interested by this, in how history is visible in the daily life And in the course of making the film, this idea that started very early actually developed much much more complex. Other than just being beside history, being beside the histories of people or the time of people, history becomes then at some moment somehow more supreme than personal time. And it became visible in how precarious the living conditions of the people in the film are. My protagonists, if you think about it, they have very little control over their own fate because there's a more supreme historical development that's happening, and that is the age of globalization that's showing at their very doorstep and trying to derail the lives that they had been building for themselves for a long time. So it's not only that history is in the backdrop of our daily lives, history comes to a point when it actually already comes inside and probably destroys. For some people, maybe they construct, but for others, they destruct.
So after the filming, you said you used to be joined by the history of the Tando, but now you are more joined to the present and the future of Tando. So what do you think is the future? What do you think is the future of the community and your family?
The reason why I made the film very open-ended is that I do not have a very straightforward answer to that. In the beginning, I might have thought that this economic system that's pervasive in the world today, which is very visible and actually affecting the lives of the people in Tondo, will definitely continue its supremacy and will definitely defeat any force of the community or people who want to continue living their lives undeterred by these developments that do not serve them. But after some time, at the end of filming of making this film, at the end of shooting, I witnessed a scene that actually changed my perspective and gave some nuance to it. I witnessed a scene whereby after a demolition in the community, and we wrapped up shooting and said, okay, it's the end of shooting, thank you very much, clap your hands. And then we went outside to the car and we ate our lunch, and then I just had a hunch that something felt wrong. It's like the people were hiding something from the camera. So I said, okay, after lunch, let's go back and just see what's there when all the cameras are gone, when the government trying to destroy the houses are gone. Let's just see and just sit there in silence. And then so we went there, and I didn't put my camera on tripod. I just brought my camera casually, and it was then that slowly the landscape of destroyed houses started to be built up again. People started to nail back their house from one plank of wood to another, one cloth for a wall, etc. And I realized that there might not be visible power in ordinary people, but when they are acting en masse, when they are acting in a big group in relation to a larger force, a traditionally larger force, they can actually affect also how history can turn. Like the institutions would like them to vacate the area, to totally flatten the area, put up a wall and expand the international port so there can be more room for containers. But the force of the survival that's pushing these people back from where they were evicted is actually probably as strong as the force that was trying to drive them away. And true enough, now despite so many millions of money being spent by the government to implement this plan of port expansion, and also many other development projects in the Philippines, because there are a lot that are infused by foreign capital, Tondo still stands there. And a lot of the people who were driven away had to come back. And it's the force of survival. It's the force of human will that's coming together. How much more, it made me ask how much more powerful that can be if this force is done with collective consciousness, because people were acting together in the same manner, but without the awareness that it's a collective action, because they were simply coming back, building back their homes because they needed it individually. But how much more power it can wield, or can it wield, if there was awareness, collective awareness going on. And that's probably why governments are also trying to be, trying hard to make ways in implementing these supposedly development projects such that they can also derail any plan for the people to do collective action, collectivize, face the government as a big group, as a sector, rather than just individual families. So yeah, I don't know. I think the answer to their fate is not in my hands. And there are really things, it's just really just like that. There are things that are not in the hands of the storyteller. It's just in the hands of the ongoing story. So
as a storyteller, what do you want audience to take away from your film?
I would say my motivation is evolved through the long years of making this film. In the beginning, the motivation was that I wanted to shed light on the similarities of the mainstream society with the people who are marginalized by the mainstream. It was a very idealistic vision that probably by showing how we are not very different from them, from the other, or what the mainstream wants to other, then you can somehow bridge the gap or something. But of course, that objective takes a larger and probably a longer, effort to be able to realize. And it's not resting only on a single film. It rests on so many other cultural works that's being done by artists, by education sector, etc. Now I think I'm humbled a bit more, and I would say that what I want for my film to do is to translate a way of looking, because that is how this filmmaking particularly changed me. It changed and it educated me organically in my way of looking, and I want to translate that way of looking through my film. In particular, I want people to have confidence that the world, however chaotic it looks like, is run in a system, and that system is not hard to decipher. It's actually very visible, and we really just have to dismantle the manufactured gazes, or the way that we are taught to look at the world. And if we set that aside and try to look at the world like for how it really appears, we are going to discover a lot of things. The system manifests in how cities look like. It's visible, and it doesn't take a genius to understand how it works. I think, just a simple virtue of openness to what is being presented in front of you can help us a lot to understand better. That's how we are as human beings. We are trained by what's presented before us, by what we see. Even the human eye was crafted by what it saw. I mean, the human eye, if you trace its evolutionary history, it comes from a long history of the eye of living things that came from a very small organism that was trained by the sunlight. And slowly, through evolutionary development, the sunlight crafted the eyes that we have now. So it's the same for the things that we have to learn in society. We have to be, the sensitivity to look at things will teach us how to look at them.
As an independent female director, but actually nowadays there are not so much female directors in the world. So do you have any suggestions for them?
Just not be hindered by anything, because I don't know. Of course, there are different conditions of women in different societies. There are women in certain societies that are freer than in other societies. ironically, there's a lot of documentary practitioners who are women. For example, the big, relatively the biggest wave of documentary practitioners that are now practicing in the Philippines are largely women. And I think what drives us is our deep feeling for certain things, no? And I think that goes against society in general, or the modern society in general, to have deep feelings for something. We are taught not to be too emotional. We are taught not to be too fixated on particular things. You're too obsessed, or things like that. I think what women should do is to continue being themselves. If they are obsessed about something, then pursue it. If they have too much feeling about something, there must be something that's giving them that much feeling. And so this one must continue to try to discover where these feelings are coming from, because that sensitivity is actually a gift rather than a liability. I think documentary is in the line of not just it's not just a form of cinema. It's not just an art. I think documentary is in the line of development of human instruments to record things from one generation to be transmitted to another generation. I think documentary isn't in the same family as the written record. The documentary is also in the same family as the photograph, of course. That's obvious. The illustrated records of the old times. I think this is family to documentary. And so I would say that documentary is an instrument that we have now, a very advanced instrument that we have now, for us to collectively teach ourselves what we understand about human life, society, the cosmos, etc. Documentary is in that field of collective understanding, which is at the very basic nature of human beings. It's inherent in documentary to be educational, not in the teaching sense or whatever, but to be a tool for us to understand what is not immediately in front of us, to understand the things that are not immediately beside each other, to understand how history evolved. For example, having seen some documentaries recently about World War II, which was screened in the Philippines like a few weeks ago, it was there I realized that documentary actually, regardless of the aesthetic qualities, documentary gains value through time. Because not only does it stay as a work of art, if it is a work of art, but it also becomes a record that we can see at any time in the future to reflect on how the time went by from then until today. No? So however valuable a film is, whether it's not too valuable, whether it's not too well released in a particular time, for as long as it's preserved and it's able to be seen in the future, 30, 40, 50 years from now, it will certainly gain value. And I do not mean value in terms of economic value. I mean, and not just cultural value, but intellectual value. And that's a very important resource for us as a society. Whereas before cinema was invented, before the dawn of cinema, the sophistication of what we are able to translate from one generation to another probably did not exist as much as it's possible today. So yeah, we are holding in our hands, whether we already realized it or not, documentary practitioners are holding in their hands a very, very valuable instrument for the course of historical development.